If you grew up anywhere near the British countryside, you knew the Range Rover, the machine on every shooting estate and every farm track, the one the Queen drove across her own land with the dogs in the back. In 1970, it invented the luxury 4x4, and the world had never seen anything like it. The first vehicle ever exhibited inside the Louvre as a work of art. It crossed the Sahara. It won the first Paris-Dakar rally on a second-hand example. It survived the collapse of the British motor industry all around it, when factory after factory fell. And then, within a single generation, the car Britain had invented stopped being Britain's at all. How does a country dream up the most desirable car in the world, and then hand it away? What really happened inside those gates at Solihull? Chapter 1. An engine on a workshop floor. The story of the world's first luxury 4x4 does not begin in a design studio or a boardroom, or even in Britain. It begins on the swept concrete floor of a boat engine workshop in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, in the winter of 1964, where a discarded American engine lay waiting for a man who wasn't looking for it. That man was William Martin Hurst, managing director of the Rover Company of Solihull. He had crossed the Atlantic on other business entirely, trying to sell Rover's engines and Rover's promising gas turbine to Carl Kiekhaefer, the formidable boss of Mercury Marine. The sale never happened, but as the story goes, Martin Hurst's eye caught something abandoned on the workshop floor, a compact aluminium V8 cast off by General Motors, who had tried building engine blocks from light alloy and given the whole idea up as more trouble than it was worth. There is another version of the tale in which it was Rover's man in North America, J. Bruce McWilliams, who first spotted the engine's promise. Both versions may be true. What isn't in doubt is what happened next. Martin Hurst measured the thing, 215 cubic inches of displacement, barely larger than the four-cylinder engine Rover was already building, and only about 12 pounds heavier. An entire V8, light enough for one man to lift, that Detroit no longer wanted. He bought it. The rights, the tooling, all of it. The deal was done over the winter of 1964, and by January of 1965, the engine belonged to Rover. A Buick engineer named Joe Turley came across the Atlantic to help make it breathe again, adapting the American design for British production and British roads. In time, it would be enlarged, strengthened and refined, and it would power not just the Range Rover, but a whole generation of British performance cars. But that was all to come. What mattered, standing on that workshop floor in Wisconsin, was that a light, compact, silky V8, 3.5 litres of alloy that one of the largest corporations on earth had judged not worth the bother, had just fallen into the hands of a company that would know exactly what to do with it. That engine would become the beating heart of the greatest thing the British motor industry ever built. Because here is the thing about Solihull in the middle of the 1960s. The works on Lode Lane had not begun as a car factory at all. It had been thrown up by the government from 1936 as a wartime shadow factory, built across 2 Warwickshire farms, Warhall and Fordrove, to turn out Bristol Hercules aero engines while the bombs fell. When Rover's Coventry works were flattened in the Blitz, the company moved out to Solihull and made the old aero engine plant its own, calling it the Meteor Works. And it was there, in 1948, that Rover had launched the Land Rover, a plain, honest, go-anywhere tool of a vehicle, beloved by farmers and armies the world over, and the machine that quietly kept the company alive. Rover itself was a byword for solid, tweedy respectability. Auntie Rover, people called it, half fondly, half not. It built well-made, unhurried, slightly conservative cars for well-made, unhurried, slightly conservative people. Nobody expected magic from Auntie Rover, and the ground beneath the company was already moving. In 1967, Rover would be absorbed by Leyland, and in the January of 1968, swept up into the vast, unwieldy British Leyland Motor Corporation, a giant conglomerate stitched together from half the British motor industry and destined to become a national byword for strife and decline. All of that lay just ahead. But for now, inside those old sheds, there was a young engineer about to make the magic nobody expected. His name was Charles Spencer King. Everybody called him Spen. Chapter 2. The Nephew and the Hose-Out Palace. Spen King was born into the business, more or less. His uncles were Maurice and Spencer Wilkes, the brothers who ran Rover, And it had been Maurice who first dreamed up the Land Rover concept after the war. King had the pedigree and the training to match the connections. He had apprenticed at Rolls-Royce from 1942, cutting his teeth on aero engines during the war, then joined Rover in 1945 and thrown himself into the company's most futuristic experiments, the gas turbine cars, the whining, spectacular Jet 1 and T3 prototypes that Rover built to prove a jet engine could drive a road car. From there, he had gone on to help shape the Rover P6, one of the most advanced saloons Britain ever produced. He was, by every account, a proper engineer. Not a stylist, not a salesman. An engineer who cared about how a thing worked and cared almost nothing for how it looked. He would later admit that he spent less than 1/10 of 1% of his time thinking about the appearance of the car that made him famous. Less than 1/10 of 1%. The most beautiful accident in British motoring was shaped by a man who could barely be bothered with beauty. The idea itself had been drifting round Solihull for years. Back in the 1950s, Gordon Bashford had sketched something called the Road Rover, a road-biased cousin to the Land Rover, a rougher first attempt at the same instinct. It went nowhere. But the instinct never quite died, and by the mid-60s, King had picked it up and sharpened it into something clearer and far more ambitious. The Americans were part of the reason. King and his colleagues had been watching what was happening across the Atlantic. The Ford Bronco, the International Harvester Scout, the Jeep Wagoneer, a whole new breed of rugged, road-friendly vehicle that hinted at an appetite nobody in Britain had yet tried to feed. So King set himself a simple, slightly mad ambition. He would take the true, go-anywhere ability of a Land Rover, the wading, the climbing, the crossing of ground no ordinary car could touch, and give it the ride, the pace, and the comfort of a proper road car. Not a farm tool that happened to be bearable. A comfortable, capable car that happened to go absolutely anywhere. It was the kind of idea that sounds obvious only after somebody has done it, and impossible right up until the moment they do. His partner in turning that ambition into metal was Gordon Bashford, a chassis genius who had joined Rover as an apprentice at the age of 14 back in 1930. Between them, King and Bashford built what they called, with no romance whatsoever, the 100-inch station wagon. Around them worked men like Tom Barton, a Land Rover engineering veteran who understood better than almost anyone how to make a vehicle survive punishment that would break an ordinary car. King made two decisions early, and both of them shaped everything that followed. First, the ex-Buick V8 would provide the power. Smooth, light, torquey, effortless, where a diesel would have been coarse and slow. Second, and against the settled instincts of the entire industry, the car would ride not on the cart springs of a working truck, but on long-travel coil springs. Coils gave it enormous articulation over broken ground, a wheel could drop into a rut and stay planted, and a supple, loping ride on the tarmac. That single, stubborn engineering choice is the reason a Range Rover could cross a desert all day and then pull up outside an opera house without having shaken its occupants to pieces. Remember the coil springs. Much later, a great deal of folklore will be blamed on suspension that this car never actually had. Then there was permanent four-wheel drive to all four wheels, all the time, through a central differential. On a production vehicle of this kind, it was close to a world first, and it gave the Range Rover a sure-footedness on road and off that its rivals simply couldn't match. The disc brakes on every corner, unusual on anything so rugged, meant it could stop from speed like a proper car rather than a lorry. Everything about the engineering came back to the same quiet conviction, that a vehicle need not choose between capability and comfort, that it could be brilliant at both if the bones were right. King had spent his life around difficult machinery, jet engines, gas turbines, the advanced running gear of the P6, and he brought to the Range Rover an engineer's refusal to accept the usual compromises. Where the industry said a car this capable must be crude, he simply declined to believe it. And the extraordinary thing is that he was right. The Range Rover could ford a river up to its wheel arches, and then settle onto a motorway and cruise in near silence. It asked its driver to give up nothing. Now, the shape. The famously clean, upright, purposeful lines of that first Range Rover were never really styled at all. Bashford and King built plain, flat, straight-edged body panels to clothe the running prototypes. Panels meant only to disguise what the machinery underneath was doing during secret testing. And management, when they saw the disguise, liked it so much they refused to let it go. The camouflage became the car. David Bash, Rover's gifted styling chief, the man behind the look of the P5 and the P6, was brought in to tidy and finish the shape, adding the details that turned it from a test mule into an icon. But the bones of that timeless silhouette were an engineer's accident that nobody could bring themselves to undo. Even the name was a piece of theatre. The development prototypes wore badges reading Velar, from the Spanish vela to veil to conceal, so that curious onlookers and press photographers wouldn't know what they were looking at. The true name, when it finally came, was credited to a stylist called Tony Poole, Range Rover. Two plain words that would end up meaning something no other two words in motoring could. And what did they fit inside this remarkable thing? Almost nothing. Vinyl seats, rubber mats, plain painted metal you could wipe with a cloth. King was convinced the buyers would be farmers and country folk, so he designed a cabin you could hose out with a bucket of water after a day's lambing. A machine capable of genuine luxury, trimmed like a stable. The palace, at the very start, was a shed on wheels, and nobody, least of all Spen King, had the faintest idea what it was about to become. Chapter 3. A farm truck in the Louvre. It reached the press on the 17th of June, 1970, and went on sale that autumn at a price of £1,998, about £32,000 in today's money. For that, you got a two-door body only, aluminium panels over a steel frame, disc brakes on all four corners, that light and eager V8 producing around 135 horsepower, and permanent four-wheel drive riding on those long coil springs. There had never been anything quite like it. Other machines could go off-road. Other machines were comfortable. Nothing did both. Land Rovers were agricultural. Luxury cars were helpless the moment the tarmac ran out. The Range Rover crossed that divide as though it had never existed, and in doing so, it didn't join a class of car. It invented one. Every luxury 4x4 that has ever followed, every gleaming machine on every suburban drive on Earth, traces its bloodline back to this single vehicle from Solihull. The motoring press could hardly find the words. Here was a car that would touch 100 miles an hour on the motorway, ride like a limousine, seat 5 in comfort, and then turn off the road and climb a mountainside without pausing for breath. Reviewers reached for comparisons and came up empty, because there was nothing to compare it to. And the buyers, when they arrived, were not always the farmers King had pictured. Some were, but others were doctors and architects, and country landowners who had never before been able to buy a single vehicle that did the school run, towed the horse box, carried the family to the coast, and still crossed a waterlogged field in January. One car for every life a person led. That was the quiet revolution underneath the aluminium panels. The world seemed to understand almost at once. In 1971, barely a year after launch, the Range Rover became the first motor vehicle ever exhibited inside the Musée du Louvre in Paris, placed there as, in the museum's own words, an exemplary work of industrial design. Sit for a moment with the strangeness of that. A vehicle King had designed to be hosed out, a machine he had barely styled, honoured inside the greatest art museum on Earth, among the treasures of civilization. That same year, closer to home, it took the Royal Automobile Club's Dewar Trophy, one of the oldest and most respected honours in British motoring. But the Range Rover did not earn its legend in galleries. It earned it in the worst places on the planet. In the December of 1971, the British Transamerica's expedition set off, led by the soldier and explorer Major John Blashford Snell. 2 Range Rovers, crewed in part by men of the 17th and 21st Lancers, were to drive the entire length of the Americas, some 18,000 miles, from the top of Alaska to the very bottom of Tierra del Fuego. And between the two continents lay the thing everyone said couldn't be done, the Darien Gap. 250 miles of swamp, jungle and rainforest, with no road at all. Ground so hostile that no vehicle in history had ever driven across it. It nearly broke them. For weeks the expedition inched forward through mud that swallowed a car to its axles, winching the Range Rovers from tree to tree, building rafts to float them over rivers, hacking a path through vegetation that closed behind them as they passed. They came out the other side in the June of 1972. The first vehicles ever to conquer the Darien Gap were a pair of British luxury cars barely 2 years old, the same kind of car you might have seen parked outside a Knightsbridge hotel. Then came the deserts. In 1974, a Range Rover crossed the Sahara, some 7,500 miles in 100 days. And in the winter that carried over into 1979 came the moment that sealed the legend for good. A brutal new event had been dreamed up, a rally from Paris to Dakar, thousands of miles down across the whole width of the Sahara, quickly reckoned the cruelest motorsport on earth. The first running set off from the Place du Trocadero in Paris on the 26th of December 1978 and finished in Dakar on the 14th of January. The car that won it outright among all the cars, car number 162, was a Range Rover, and not some pampered factory special either. It was a second-hand 3.5-litre V8, an ordinary used car, crewed by 3 Frenchmen, Alain Genestier, Joseph Terbiot, and Jean Lemordant. A luxury vehicle bought off a forecourt won the world's toughest desert race at its very first attempt. A Range Rover would win the Dakar again in 1981, in the hands of René Mege and Bernard Giraud, and go on to a formidable record across the decade. By the early 80s, the car had lent its name and its toughness to another epic of endurance too, the Camel Trophy, hauling teams through the jungles of Sumatra and Papua New Guinea. Consider what all of that amounted to. The same machine that hung in the Louvre as a work of art could win the Sahara. The same car a duchess might drive to a point-to-point could out-endure vehicles built for nothing but racing across dunes. It carved deserts, and it crossed drawing rooms with equal grace. There was, quite simply, nothing else on earth that did what this thing did, and Britain had built it, at Solihull, half by accident, out of an engine that America had thrown away. And every one of those adventures was worth more than any advertisement Solihull could ever have bought. A vehicle that had crossed the Darien Gap, won the Dakar and conquered the Sahara did not need to argue about its toughness. It had proved it in front of the world, in the hardest places there were. That reputation, for a car that could take absolutely anything and keep going, became the bedrock of everything the Range Rover was. The luxury could grow, the price could climb, the leather could get softer year by year. Underneath it all sat that unshakable promise. This thing will get you there and get you home. It is worth remembering how hard won that trust was, because in the years to come it would be spent, carelessly, almost to the last penny. Chapter 4. The Queen's Estate and the Vogue Shoot. For a while, the country understood the Range Rover exactly as Spen King had imagined it, as a superb and serious tool. It was a farmer's machine and a gamekeeper's machine, a car for the shooting estate and the horse box and the flooded lane in February. It belonged to a Britain of waxed jackets and muddy Labradors, and the long drive north to somewhere cold and beautiful. You bought one because you had land or work or both, and you needed to reach the far corner of it, whatever the weather had done to the ground. Nowhere was that image truer than on the royal estates. Land Rover had held a royal warrant since 1951, granted by King George VI, and by the 1990s it would hold a distinction almost no company in Britain could match. All 4 available warrants at once, from the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prince of Wales, and the Queen Mother. And this was not badge-holding for the brochure. Queen Elizabeth II was a genuine enthusiast, photographed again and again at the wheel of her own Range Rovers across the vast acres of Balmoral, Sandringham, and Windsor. She held no driving licence, they are issued in her name, so she needed none. And out on her own land she drove herself, a monarch in a British 4x4, mud on the sills and dogs in the back. If you wanted a single picture of what the Range Rover meant to Britain in those years, that was it. But something had begun to shift beneath all that Barber and Green Wellington respectability, because it turned out that the people who wanted a Range Rover were not, in the end, only farmers and gamekeepers. The turn came, of all places, from the world of high fashion. Late in 1980, Land Rover worked with the London coach builder Wood and Pickett to build a lavishly appointed 2-door prototype. Soft leather where there had been vinyl, thick carpet where King had bolted rubber mats, luxury heaped onto a machine designed to resist it, and lent it to Vogue magazine. Vogue took the car to Biarritz for a glossy fashion shoot, all Lancôme cosmetics and Jaeger clothes, and beautiful people posed against the Atlantic. The photographs ran, and the response was immediate and unmistakable. Readers didn't write in about the clothes. They wrote in about the car. Land Rover, sensing something, moved quickly. It rushed out a run of 1,000 specially trimmed cars and called them, with a knowing wink to where the whole idea had come from, the In Vogue. They went on sale in the spring of 1981 and sold out almost at once. The name stuck, and it climbed. By 1985, Vogue had become the badge worn by the flagship Range Rover. The plush one, the quiet one, the expensive one, the one that had left the stable behind for good. You can read the transformation in the specification sheets, like rings in a felled tree. A four-door body arrived in 1981 because families and the well-heeled wanted proper rear doors, not a working two-door. An automatic gearbox followed in 1982, and a 5-speed manual came the same year to smooth out the long miles. A diesel option arrived in 1986 using an Italian engine from a firm called VM Motori for buyers who wanted the range and the economy of oil. Real leather and serious wood and genuine luxury came through the middle of the decade. Each passing year, the hose-out farm truck grew grander, softer, quieter and dearer. The car Spen King had built to be sluiced down with a bucket was becoming, model by model, a rolling drawing room on tall wheels. And all of it was still made at Solihull, by Solihull hands. The men and women on Lode Lane took a real and specific pride in the Range Rover. It was the jewel of the place, the car the whole world suddenly wanted, built in the same works that had turned out aero engines in the war and Land Rovers ever since. There was craft in it. The aluminium bodywork was hand-finished. The trim, as it grew more lavish, demanded more skill, not less. A worker on that line could stand at the gate at the end of a shift and know that somewhere on a royal estate, or a Beverly Hills drive, or a desert rally, the thing his hands had helped build was carrying its reputation for him. For a British car factory in the 1980s, that pride was a rare and precious thing. Overseeing much of that climb was a tough, capable manufacturing man named Tony Gilroy, who took charge of Land Rover at the start of 1983. Gilroy had come up the hard way through the British motor industry, and he could read the situation plainly. The Vogue phenomenon had revealed something the company had never dared assume, that beneath the muddy, practical image of the Range Rover lay an enormous, unproven, hungry appetite for luxury. Move the car firmly upmarket, and there were fortunes waiting to be made. It was the obvious call. Working alongside him on product strategy was Alan Edis, and together they pushed the Range Rover further and further up the market, chasing that appetite wherever it led. Commercially, it was exactly the right thing to do. Spen King watched all of this with a kind of weary bemusement. He had built a tool, and the world was busy turning it into a trophy. Out in the towns, a new and slightly mocking phrase was already taking hold for the shining 4x4s that never saw a field, the Chelsea tractor, bought for the school run, and the supermarket car park rather than the moor. King himself would grumble, late in his life, that the car had never been meant as a status symbol at all, and he could be witheringly plain about the drivers he saw hauling children about. In enormous off-roaders, they would never take off a road. He had made something genuinely useful. He lived long enough to watch the world remake it into something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Summit and the Seed. There was one great market the Range Rover had never properly conquered, and by the middle of the 80s, Solihull was determined to fix it. Land Rover had pulled out of the United States altogether back in 1974, leaving the richest car market on earth to a trickle of grey imports and a great deal of unsatisfied longing. So in March of 1987, the company went back in properly, setting up Range Rover of North America in Lanham, Maryland, and offering Americans at last, and officially, the real thing. It was a sensation. The Range Rover arrived in the United States carrying 2 full decades of mystique, and it landed straight in the laps of the famous. Jack Nicholson wanted one. Goldie Hawn wanted one. It slid into hip-hop records and Hollywood driveways and Manhattan doormen's memories, and became, almost overnight, the most fashionable way in the world to own a piece of Britain. The hose-out farm truck from a converted aero engine factory in Warwickshire was now a passport to glamour on 2 continents at once. The Americans took to it precisely because it was everything their own trucks were not. It was British. It was aristocratic. It had crossed deserts and hung in the Louvre and carried the Queen of England across her own estates. To buy a Range Rover in 1987 was to buy a piece of a story that no domestic rival could touch, and the buyers understood that perfectly and paid handsomely for the privilege. For a car conceived to be hosed out after lambing, it was a remarkable place to have arrived. And it was profitable, one of the very few genuine, unqualified successes in a British motor industry whose story through those years was mostly one of loss and retreat. Crucially, the Range Rover had been sheltered from the worst of that wider collapse. Under the reforming boss Michael Edwards, Land Rover had been hived off as a separate company as far back as 1978, given its own management and its own promised funding, deliberately walled off from the chaos consuming the rest of the group. While much of British Leyland burned through the late 70s and 80s, Solihull, for a golden stretch, thrived. These were the peak years, roughly 1987 through to 1992. The four-door had matured into a genuinely fine motor car. The V8 had grown to 3.9 litres in 1989 and would swell again to 4.2 litres by 1992. And the Range Rover became a showcase for one clever first after another. Anti-lock brakes on a 4x4 in 1989. Nobody had fitted them to a vehicle like this before. Electronic traction control arrived, and so at the very top of the range did electronic air suspension in 1992, offered on the long wheelbase flagship. Each innovation made the car cleverer, plusher, more advanced, more desirable than the last. The prestige had never stood higher. The order books had never been fuller. Everything, seen from the outside, looked like pure triumph. But look closely at what was actually happening up there on the summit, and you can already make out the shadow lengthening across the sunlit ground. Because the Range Rover of the late 80s and early 90s was, underneath all its new sophistication, still fundamentally the car Spen King had drawn in the 1960s. The same body-on-frame architecture, the same essential bones, now more than 20 years old. And onto those aging bones, in the understandable and relentless push-up market, Solihull was bolting layer upon layer of complex modern electronics. Fuel injection had arrived in 1986, replacing the honest old carburetors. Then came anti-lock brakes, electric windows, central locking, air suspension on the flagship, and looms of wiring, sensors and solenoids the original vehicle had never been imagined to carry. More electronics meant more systems that could fail. More complexity meant more to go wrong, and all of it was being assembled to the build standards of the British motor industry of that era, and wired up increasingly with electrical components from a great old Birmingham supplier whose name was about to become the most famous liability in the entire trade. A company called Lucas. But hold that thought. Because the neat, cruel version of this story, the one in the very title, the idea that a single supplier's blunder almost destroyed the whole thing, is far too simple to be true, and the honest history is both sadder and stranger than that. We will get to Lucas and to the Prince of Darkness, and to what really did and did not go wrong. For now, understand only this: there is a cruel symmetry in it. The very things that made the Range Rover irresistible in 1987, the electric everything, the fuel injection, the clever suspension, the sense of a machine that thought for you, were the very things that would, within a few short years, start to fail. A carburettor is a simple thing. A man with a screwdriver can coax it back to life on a cold morning. A modern fuel injection system, wired through a web of connectors and earths and sensors, is not simple at all. When it goes wrong in ways that leave the driver stranded and the mechanic scratching his head. The more the car promised, the more it had to keep, and the harder it became to keep it. Nobody inside those walls, drunk on the American triumph, the celebrity clientele, the record profits, the sheer glorious momentum of it all, could quite see it yet. But the seed of the Range Rover's undoing was not planted in the years of its decline. It was planted here, at the very peak, in the very act of reaching for greatness. Every clever new circuit that made the car more luxurious also made it a little more fragile, and the trust that Solihull had won so hard out in the deserts and the jungles was about to be tested in the one place it had never been tested before. The ordinary driveway on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the car simply would not start. The summit had been reached, and on the far side of every summit, hidden entirely until you are standing right on top of it, is the long way down. Chapter 6. The Prince of Darkness. To understand what went wrong, you have to go back to a man who had been dead for the better part of a century before the first Range Rover turned a wheel. Joseph Lucas was born in Birmingham in 1834, and he founded his company in 1872, selling oil lamps from a handcart. His great early success was a bicycle lamp he called the King of the Road, and from that small beginning, Lucas grew into one of the giants of British industry, a vast supplier of electrical and mechanical parts to almost every car maker in the land. Joseph Lucas died in 1902, and here is the first thing the title of this story gets wrong, because the famous wounding nickname that would attach itself to his firm, the Prince of Darkness, was not coined by embittered British owners at all. It was an American joke, made decades after Joseph Lucas was in his grave, about British cars whose electrics had a habit of failing after dark. The nickname stuck because it was funny, and it was funny because it contained a grain of truth. But only a grain. The honest picture of Lucas is far more complicated and far sadder than the punchline suggests. Lucas engineers were not fools. Many of their designs were sound, good, even clever. What let them down, again and again, was not the drawing board but the factory floor. Quality control eroded by cost-cutting, components built to a price rather than to a standard, in a British industry that was slowly starving itself of investment. There is an old story, told and retold in every pub near every car works, that Rolls-Royce would order 1,000 Lucas parts, test them all, and keep only the best handful. Whether it is literally true hardly matters. What matters is that people believed it, because it fitted what they saw. And what they saw, by the middle of the 1980s, was a Range Rover growing more electronically complicated by the year. When fuel injection replaced the old carburetors in 1986, it came from Lucas. As the years went on, the system evolved into a Lucas engine management unit known as the 14CUX, fitted to the big V8s into the mid-90s. It had real, documented weaknesses, a troublesome idle control system chief among them, and, worse, it was what mechanics came to call a closed box. There was no proper way to plug in and ask the car what was wrong. When it misbehaved, you were reduced to guesswork, and around that central system swirled the whole folklore of British electrical misery: corroded earths, connectors that failed in the damp, wiring looms that developed gremlins nobody could quite trace. Some of that is well documented. Some of it is the kind of story that grows in the telling. All of it stuck to the Range Rover's name, like mud that would not wash off. But the electronics were never the whole story. They were a symptom. The disease was deeper, and it was killing the entire body of the British motor industry around the Range Rover. Because while Solihull built its jewel, the vast enterprise it belonged to was falling apart. In December of 1974, British Leyland ran out of money. The government commissioned an inquiry under Sir Don Ryder, and the Ryder report of March 1975 laid the sickness bare: worn-out machinery, incoherent model plans, and industrial relations poisoned beyond easy repair. That summer, on the 17th of June, 1975, 5 years, almost to the week after the Range Rover's launch, the British Leyland Act took the whole troubled empire into public ownership, with Tony Benn, the industry secretary, carrying it into the hands of the state. The company that owned the world's most admired new car was now a ward of the taxpayer, its fate argued over in Parliament and the newspapers, its future no longer its own to decide. Into this chaos, in November of 1977, came a small, blunt South African named Michael Edwards, plucked from the chloride battery group to try to save the unsavable. Edwards closed factories. He shed tens of thousands of jobs. He faced down the trade unions and, in a confrontation that gripped the nation, engineered the removal of the shop steward Derek Robinson, Red Robbo to the newspapers, whose ability to stop the lines had become legendary. Edwards had no patience for sentiment. You could not turn a business like this around, he said, with tea and sympathy. He was hard because the situation was desperate, and one of his hardest, wisest moves would end up mattering more to the Range Rover than almost anything else. Back in 1978, he had walled Land Rover off as a separate company, protecting it from the fire consuming the rest, but no wall was high enough to keep out everything. The rot reached Solihull in quieter ways. The facilities were aging. The Range Rover's underpinnings were pure 1960s, soldiering on into a new decade. Beneath the proud aluminium skin, which never rusted, sat a steel frame that did, quietly, from the inside out, so that many a Range Rover looked immaculate right up until the day its chassis crumbled. There was something almost cruel in that particular failing. A car that could still gleam on the drive, its bodywork perfect, while the steel that held it together dissolved unseen beneath. And the beloved V8, that Wisconsin miracle, had weaknesses of its own that grew worse as it was bored out larger and larger. Cylinder liners that could slip in their block, a tendency to run hot and blow its head gaskets when it was worked hard on a summer's day. The original 3.5-litre had been tough as a boot. Each increase in size, chasing more power for the ever heavier luxury car, traded a little of that toughness away. None of these things on its own was fatal. Rust can be treated. A head gasket can be replaced. An idle valve can be coaxed. But they were gathering all at once in the same car, at the same moment that the price and the prestige were climbing higher than ever. And the men in charge were about to make a series of decisions that would turn a collection of manageable weaknesses into a reputation for unreliability that would outlive the car itself. Chapter 7. The Fatal Decisions. The first decision was the one that had looked, at the time, like pure inspiration, to drive the Range Rover relentlessly upmarket, and the man who drove it hardest was Tony Gilroy. When Gilroy took charge of Land Rover at the start of 1983, he did not find a company in glowing health. By the accounts of those who were there, he found quality that was poor, a workforce that was disillusioned, and a management that had grown apathetic. He was a manufacturing man to his bones, and he set about the place with a hard hand, including, fatefully, deep cuts to the engineering department. There is a terrible logic to cutting engineers when the money is short. They are expensive, and their work does not show up on next quarter's balance sheet. Their value is invisible right up until the moment it is missing, until the car that should have been tested for another 6 months goes on sale instead, and the faults that a fuller engineering team would have caught turn up one by one on customers' driveways. Every engineer let go was a small, invisible mortgage taken out against the car's future reliability, and the bill would come due later, with interest, in the form of a reputation nobody could afford to lose. The wider logic of the decision was sound. The Vogue phenomenon had proved there was money in luxury, and chasing that money was the right commercial call. But there is a difference between deciding to build a more luxurious car and actually investing in the engineering and the quality control to make that luxury reliable. The first is a decision made in a boardroom in an afternoon. The second costs money, year after year, patient and unglamorous, that a cash-starved company inside a broke conglomerate simply did not have. So the specification climbed, and the price climbed, and the complexity climbed, and the money to guarantee it all worked did not climb with them. The Range Rover was being asked to become a Mercedes-Benz on the budget of a company that could barely keep the lights on. Think of the bind those engineers were in. They were told to add electric seats, air conditioning, fuel injection, anti-lock brakes, the whole apparatus of 1980s luxury, and then told to do it without the testing budgets, the quality systems, the patient investment that a Mercedes or a BMW took for granted. They did their best, but you cannot conjure reliability out of goodwill. A luxury car that works is the product of money spent long before the customer ever sees it, spent on rigs and trials and rejected parts, and that money was exactly what a company inside the wreckage of British Leyland did not have to spend. Spenking watched from a distance and mourned in his plain way that his honest tool had become a status symbol. And Gilroy himself, the man who had done so much to build the modern Range Rover and who fathered its rugged stablemate the Discovery, would leave before that Discovery even launched. His attempt to lead a management buyout under the banner of keeping Land Rover British blocked from above. The irony is bitter. A man fighting to keep the company British was pushed out, and within a few short years the company would cease to be British at all. The second fatal decision flowed straight from the first. Having chosen luxury, Solihull chose to deliver it through ever more electronics, and to buy a great deal of those electronics from Lucas. Now, in fairness, this was how everyone delivered luxury in the 1980s. Electric windows and fuel injection and anti-lock brakes were the currency of the premium market, and you could not compete without them. But there were choices within the choice. Better systems existed. The German firm Bosch made fuel injection of formidable reliability, the very kind that would later be fitted to the Range Rover's own successor. Whether Lucas was chosen over such rivals for reasons of cost, or loyalty to a struggling British supplier, or simple habit, is not something the record makes perfectly clear. What is clear is the result. The car that had proved itself in the Sahara now stumbled in the suburbs, and every flickering dashboard and every no-start morning was laid, fairly or not, at the door of the Prince of Darkness. And picture what that actually meant, out in the world, to the people who had spent a small fortune on the finest 4x4 money could buy. It meant a warning light that came on for no reason and would not go off. It meant a car that ran perfectly for a fortnight, and then, on a cold Tuesday with the children waiting, simply would not turn over. It meant a trip to a garage where the mechanic, however skilled, could not interrogate the closed box under the bonnet, and so replaced one part, then another, charging for each, while the fault came and went like a ghost. A Rolls-Royce breaks down rarely and grandly. A Range Rover of this era could let you down on a wet roundabout in a way that felt almost personal, and the owners, wealthy, influential, exactly the sort of people whose opinion travels, told everybody. Trust, once punctured, leaks quietly and never quite refills. The desert legend was being unmade one flat battery at a time. The third fatal decision was about where all this played out, because Solihull chose, at last, to take the Range Rover to America, and America was the most unforgiving audience in the world. Land Rover had abandoned the United States back in 1974, and the official return in 1987, glorious as it was, dropped the Range Rover into a market obsessed with reliability, a market that kept score, and it did not arrive alone. The wider Rover group was pushing another British car into America at almost exactly the same time, the Sterling, a rebadged Rover 800, and the Sterling became a national byword for shoddy build and electrical faults, its reputation curdling almost on contact. On the 9th of August, 1991, the group's chief executive, George Simpson, announced that the Sterling would withdraw from America altogether after just 35,739 cars had been sold in 5 years. The Range Rover survived where the Sterling did not, but it breathed the same poisoned air. In the great American reliability surveys, the ones that ordinary buyers actually read before they signed, the words British and unreliable were fusing together into a single idea, and that idea would prove almost impossible to break. It dogs Land Rover in those surveys to this very day. That is the peculiar cruelty of the American market. It does not forgive, and it does not forget, because it writes everything down. A German or a Japanese rival that stumbled once could recover. A British mark that stumbled once was filed, permanently, under a heading it could never quite escape. The very reputation for toughness that the Range Rover had earned in the hardest terrain on Earth counted for nothing against a column of survey scores compiled from suburban driveways. Sand and jungle had made the legend. Spreadsheets, quietly, were unmaking it. 3 decisions then. Go up market without the money to guarantee quality. Deliver the luxury through fragile electronics, and carry the whole fragile edifice into the one market that would judge it most harshly and remember longest. Each decision was reasonable. Each was defensible on the day it was made. Together, quietly, they were lethal. Not to the car, which kept selling, but to the trust that had taken deserts and jungles and a decade of triumph to build. And yet, none of this, not Lucas, not the rust, not the American surveys, is the true tragedy of the Range Rover. The true tragedy was about to arrive in a boardroom in Munich. Chapter 8. The English Patient. In 1988, the government sold what remained of the old British Leyland, now the Rover Group, to British Aerospace, for something in the region of £150 million. It was meant to be a fresh start under British ownership. It was, in truth, a holding action. British Aerospace was itself stretched, and it had little appetite for the endless investment a carmaker devours. Rover limped on, kept alive in large part by a quiet, deepening partnership with the Japanese firm Honda, which shared the engineering that Rover could no longer afford to do alone. And then, on the 31st of January 1994, came the sale that changed everything. British Aerospace sold its controlling stake in Rover to the German giant BMW for £800 million in cash, around $1.2 billion, a striking return on the $150 million it had paid just 6 years before. The deal was driven by BMW's chairman, Bernd Pischetsrieder, a genuine enthusiast for British cars and, as it happened, a grandnephew of Alec Isigonis, the man who designed the Mini. His own board member, Wolfgang Reitzler, had grave doubts, and the due diligence, the careful inspection a buyer makes before spending more than $1 billion, took, by many accounts, something like 10 days. 10 days to weigh the whole of a company. It was nowhere near enough. BMW failed to grasp just how completely Rover had come to depend on Honda, and Honda, learning that its partner had been sold to a rival behind its back, felt betrayed and walked away. The engineering lifeline was cut, and when BMW's teams finally examined in full what they had bought, they were appalled by its condition. Inside BMW, the new acquisition acquired a nickname of its own, one that would become notorious: the English patient, a sick thing they had taken on and now had to try to cure. Consider the Honda blow alone. For years, Honda had quietly kept Rover breathing, sharing platforms and engineering and the discipline of a company that actually knew how to build reliable cars. That partnership was the closest thing Rover had to a future, and it was severed not by any failure of the cars, but by the sale itself, by a British owner cashing out to the highest bidder without, it seemed, fully reckoning what the sale would cost. The Japanese did not shout. They simply withdrew and took their reliability with them, and left BMW holding a company far frailer than the one it thought it had bought. They tried. To their credit, BMW poured money into Rover, billions of pounds, new models, a great new engine plant. But the patient did not recover, and the bleeding would not stop. By the end, the losses were running at something like £2 million a day. £2 million, every single day, vanishing into a company that could not be made well. Pischetsrieder, the man whose dream this had been, was gone by February of 1999, and Reitzler, the doubter who had been proved right, went with him. The dreamer and the skeptic fell together, and in 2000, BMW gave up. It broke the old Rover group apart and dismembered it. The volume car business, MG and Rover, was handed to a group of local businessmen called the Phoenix Consortium, led by John Towers, for a nominal £10. £10 for what had once been the heart of the British motor industry. BMW kept the Mini and the Cowley plant for itself, and Land Rover, Solihull's jewel, the maker of the Range Rover, was sold to the American giant Ford for £1.85 billion, around $2.7 billion, with the deal completing on the 30th of June, 2000. The sale was handled for BMW by its new chairman, Joachim Milberg. Ford's chief executive Jack Nasser welcomed his prize warmly, calling Land Rover truly one of the world's great brands. He was right. It was. And it was no longer British. Ford meant it kindly, and Ford meant to stay. It spoke of investment and stewardship and a long future, and for a while it delivered exactly that. But note the shape of the thing, because it is the shape of the whole story. Every new owner arrived with good intentions and real money. British Aerospace meant to give Rover a fresh start. BMW meant to cure the English patient. Ford meant to build the brand for a generation. And each of them, in turn, when the weather changed and the losses mounted, or the cash was needed elsewhere, did the same thing the last one had done. They sold. Good intentions were never the missing ingredient. Staying power was. Understand what had happened here, because it is the real heart of this story, and it has almost nothing to do with a supplier of dashboard lamps. Britain had invented the world's first luxury 4x4, and then, decade by decade, unable to fund it and unable to govern it, Britain had let it go. Nationalised, privatised, sold to British Aerospace, sold to Germany, and now sold on to America. The workers who had built it with such pride watched their company change hands above their heads in transactions measured in billions, in assets and liabilities, in due diligence reports drawn up in a fortnight. Somewhere a report was written. Somewhere a figure was agreed. And the ownership of the enterprise on which so many lives and so much pride had been built changed hands in the language of the balance sheet rather than the language of the works floor. There is a particular grief in that £10 sale of MG and Rover. £10, less than the price of a tank of petrol for what had been, within living memory, the beating heart of the British motor industry, the company of the Mini and the Metro and 100,000 jobs. Longbridge, the Great Midlands, works where so much of that industry had lived and laboured, would struggle on under the Phoenix men for a few more years and then die, Finally and completely, in 2005, the Range Rover would live. But the country that dreamed it up had, piece by piece, sold the dream and would spend the years afterwards buying back its own cars as imports and calling their Britishness a selling point. Chapter 9. The car that scraped the road. Now we come to the most famous accusation of all, the one about the Range Rover that sank to the ground, that scraped the road, that sat helpless on its bump stops at the traffic lights. It is real. It happened. Owners lived it and cursed it and told everyone they knew, and the story spread until it swallowed the whole mark. But here is the truth that the title of this story hides, and it matters more than almost anything else. It was not the car we have been following. Remember the coil springs. Remember Spen King choosing them at the very beginning for that loping ride and that mountain goat articulation. For essentially the whole of its 26-year life, the original Range Rover, the Classic as it came to be known, rode on those coil springs. Only right at the very end, on a rare and expensive long-wheelbase flagship built in tiny numbers in the early 90s, did electronic air suspension appear on the Classic at all. The car that became infamous for collapsing was the second-generation Range Rover, the one known inside the works as the P38A, after the building where it was designed. It arrived on the 28th of September, 1994, and it wore electronic air suspension across the entire range as standard, and that air suspension became a byword for misery. Airbags that leaked, compressors that wore out, valve blocks whose tiny seals failed, cars that knelt down overnight, that danced at junctions, that refused to rise. Every joke about a Range Rover scraping the tarmac, every meme of the great British 4x4 sitting in the road like a wounded animal, belongs to this successor. Not to the coil-sprung Classic, not to the car that crossed the Darien Gap. The folklore convicted the wrong vehicle. Picture the owner of one of these second-generation cars coming out to the drive on a frosty morning to find his gleaming £40,000 Range Rover hunkered down on its rubber bump stops like a dog that would not get up. Picture him at the traffic lights, feeling the whole car sink at the front as a valve gave out, the headlamps dipping toward the road. It was the kind of failure that turned heads and burned reputations, precisely because it was so visible, so absurd, so public. You cannot hide a car that will not stand up, and because most people never knew, or never cared, which generation was which, the shame of it rolled backwards and stuck to every Range Rover ever made, including the honest, coil-sprung Classic that had never done any such thing in its life. But by the time the P38A was earning that unhappy reputation, the Classic itself was already gone. In February of 1996, the last original Range Rover rolled off the line at Solihull, somewhere north of 317,000 of them built across those 26 years, the exact final figure, a matter that sources still quarrel over. The hose-out farm truck that had become a rolling drawing room, the desert crosser that had hung in the Louvre, was finished. An era closed with barely a pause on the line, because its replacement was already being built alongside it. No fanfare, no last shift ceremony that anyone recorded for the ages. Just the quiet end of the vehicle that had invented an entire class of car, slipping away while the world's attention was fixed on the newer, cleverer, far more fragile machine that had taken its place. There remains that promise from the very title, the idea that BMW rode in and rebuilt the electronics from scratch, that the Germans fixed everything the British had bungled. Like so much else in this story, it is real, and it is misremembered. BMW did engineer a genuinely new, deeply modern Range Rover, the third generation, known as the L322, built to share its electrical architecture with the mighty BMW 7 Series limousine. It was, at last, a Range Rover with electronics worthy of the name. But by the time it reached customers in the early 2000s, BMW had already sold Land Rover to Ford and walked away. BMW rebuilt the Range Rover's electronics and then left before the world could see the result. The rescuer had gone home before the rescue was even unveiled. Ford would hold Land Rover for 8 years, pairing it eventually with Jaguar, investing, steadying, building. And then, in the financial storm gathering at the end of the decade, Ford needed cash, and it did what everyone before it had done. It sold. On the 26th of March, 2008, Ford agreed to sell Jaguar and Land Rover together to the Indian conglomerate Tata Motors for around $2.3 billion. And so the last British-born owner passed the Range Rover into Indian hands, where it remains. Solihull kept building. The badge kept its Britishness as a marketing asset. But the ownership of one of the greatest ideas Britain ever had was now, and would stay, somewhere else entirely. And here is the strangest turn of all. Under Tata, freed at last from the churn and the starvation, Land Rover flourished. The investment came and stayed. The Range Rover grew into one of the most desirable and profitable luxury vehicles on earth. The thing that Britain had never quite managed to do for its own invention, fund it properly, steadily, with belief, was finally done, and done well, by an owner half a world away. There is no bitterness owed to Tata for that. If anything, there is gratitude. But it sharpens the ache, rather than soothing it, because it proves the tragedy was never that the car could not be saved. It could. It was that Britain was never the one to save it. Chapter 10. The Ruins of Ownership. Here is where a story like this usually ends, standing in the long grass outside a dead factory, listening to the wind move through broken windows. But the Range Rover will not give us that ending, because the strangest thing of all is that Solihull never died. Go to Lode Lane today, and you will not find a ruin. You will find one of the busiest, most advanced car plants in Europe. More than 10,700 people at work, £1.5 billion of investment poured in, the largest aluminium body shop on the continent, still turning out Range Rovers that the whole world still wants. The gates the wartime workers walked through, that Spen King walked through, that built the Desert Crosser and the Louvre exhibit, are open and loud and alive. Whatever we are mourning here, it is not a silent works. So, where are the ruins? They are two. The first is the ruin of ownership itself, the quiet, invisible loss that no photograph can show. There is no derelict building to stand in, no rusted sign to read. There is only the fact that the profits, the decisions, the destiny of Britain's greatest motoring idea now belong to others, and have for a very long time. The car is more successful than King ever dreamed. It simply is not Britain's anymore. That is a ruin you feel, rather than see. The second ruin is real and physical, and almost nobody thinks to visit it. It is Lucas, the Prince of Darkness, the great scapegoat, the firm blamed for everything. It is gone, more completely than the car it supposedly ruined. Through the 1990s, the old Birmingham giant was swallowed and broken up, merged with an American firm, then taken over by another, its proud old name dissolved into the alphabet soup of global corporations, its works on Great King Street and Shaftmore Lane, closed, demolished, sold off for housing and retail parks. The company that made the king of the road lamp, that lit the bicycles and the cars of an empire, has been erased from the map of the city that built it. If you want to stand in an industrial ruin at the end of this story, do not go to Solihull. Go looking for Lucas. You will struggle to find that it was ever there at all. And the car, the unreliable nightmare, the electrical joke, the machine that supposedly one mistake almost destroyed, the Range Rover Classic is now a treasured, appreciating classic, sought after, restored, cherished by the very people whose fathers cursed its flickering dashboards. Land Rover itself now runs a program it calls Reborn, launched at the Great Paris Classic Car Show in February of 2017, taking original classics back to the works and restoring them to factory condition. The company's own Tim Hannig set the tone when he confirmed that prices for those completed restorations would start at £135,000. Specialists build modern-engined versions for tens of thousands more. The car that was mocked for its Lucas gremlins has become a blue-chip collectible, worth many times what it cost new, wanted more now than it ever was when it was merely reliable transport. So, in the end, the title lied to us, kindly, but completely. It was never one mistake. It was not really Lucas, though Lucas took the blame and paid with its life. It was not the collapsing suspension, which belonged to another car entirely. It was a slower, sadder, more human thing than that. It was a brilliant idea, born half by accident out of a cast-off American engine, and an engineer who could not be bothered with beauty, and then handed from owner to owner by a country that could never quite afford the thing it had been clever enough to invent. Britain made the world's first luxury 4x4. Britain simply could not find a way to keep it, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson buried in all of it, though the eulogist is wary of lessons. That a nation can be brilliant enough to imagine a thing the world has never seen, and build it and prove it in the cruelest deserts on earth, and still, for want of money and steadiness and belief, lose the right to call it its own. The mistake, if there was one, was never a wiring loom. It was a whole country's slow failure of nerve. The V8 lay on that Wisconsin workshop floor once, waiting for a man who wasn't even looking for it. Everything came from that, and everything, in the end, slipped away. Not through one failure, but through a long, quiet series of reasonable decisions, each one moving the thing a little further from the country that first dreamed it up. The Range Rover survived them all. It survives still, out on the roads tonight, more successful than Spen-King could ever have imagined, and no longer his or ours. That is the miracle and the heartbreak of it.